Hey, everyone.
Good afternoon.
Hi, folks.
Good afternoon, board members. Thanks for being here. It's the way we get extra work out of you.
Jackie, how's the snow?
It's been good, but I think we're going into like a 48-degree week here, so I think spring is in the air, Jessica. We kind of ramped up, but things don't look so positive going forward. But I heard Denver got a good whacking this last week, right?
Yeah.
Yep.
My son had a snow day. He was having a ball.
Whoa, that's awesome.
Most Denver schools have gone to remote learning days instead of snow days, but our school, we stuck with the snow day.
That's good. Everybody needs a snow day from time to time.
I think so too.
Yeah, I ended up spending the night in Denver that night, Tuesday night. And so, yeah, woke up with all the snow. But yeah, unfortunate, as Jackie mentioned, the mountains really didn't get any. So it's too bad. But the Front Range needs snow too, right?
Maybe those tunnels can go both ways. Who knows?
I think I'd rather have it actually up in the mountains personally, but how about you, Steve? Director Anderson, have you got much snow?
Not near enough. In fact, the snowtail sites are going the wrong way right now. So we're backing up. Thursday's supposed to be a snowy here, so hopefully that'll help the cause. I got a good job, but I sure enjoy it when I got a lot more ammunition than I've got right now.
All right, it looks like it's 1:02. And I think if everyone's good with it, we can maybe go ahead and kick things off. And I thought maybe we could start with Dan and Becky if you want to provide any introductory remarks, and then I can take it from there.
Sure. Becky, do you want me to start or do you want to start?
You go ahead, Dan.
Okay. Well, it's good to see everyone. First of all, I hope you all are doing well and staying healthy. It's hard to believe that later on this week will be the 1-year anniversary of the first COVID case in Colorado. And just to think, just today on my Facebook post, how you can see like memories pop up. Does everyone know what Facebook is, by the way? Yes. But, and it was a memory of me walking into our accounting division on the 4th floor of 1313 Sherman and handing out awards for folks that have worked for the DNR for 1 year, 5 year, 10 year, 20 year. And that just seems like yesterday. And then fast forward, look at our lives. Most of us are working from home. We're juggling, kids or grandparents and trying to stay healthy and having our groceries delivered to our house if possible. It's just been unique and crazy to say the least. So I really, I had earlier today a DNR-wide town hall meeting, and I really urge folks and our team urge folks to really take some vacation time if you can. Take time for yourself to do what you need to do to recharge, whether it's going for a run or go fishing or whatever it may be, because it's hard to believe that what we've really accomplished, but what we've been through over this year anniversary of COVID in the state of Colorado. So I know we're not here to talk about COVID. We're here to talk about demand management. And I'm going to try to participate for about an hour or so today, but I really appreciate Becky Mitchell, you and Amy Ostick and all the staff are really working hard to put together, what this framework, could possibly look at. I think it's important to look at, the potential trade-offs, the potential equity issues, impacts, available mitigation options, and really have a large tent of folks that are providing input of what they like, what they don't, and really just evaluate every tool in the toolbox to help us protect from the impacts of climate change. And, as a wildland firefighter, that's definitely near and dear to my heart. And I just really appreciate everyone's due diligence to really, explore this and ask the tough questions and really see, where we land on this. And again, I just think the more input we have, I think that'll be really important for, as we contemplate, what next steps may look like. But thank you again, Director Mitchell, for your leadership and for your team's leadership, and to the CWCB board members too, to the directors for all of your amazing work. Thank you.
And thanks, Dan, and thanks for the support. And having Dan here is a really big deal. Remember that this is a workshop. This isn't a board meeting. And what's different about that is that that we're really kind of working through the issues, talking about them, and but not making any decisions today. And so I think that's important to remember. But we have seen, and everybody, as they were getting on the call, we're talking about the snow and where Denver receives snow, and that it's warm up in the Yampa Basin. And so it made me think about water security and the drought issues and the significant impacts that they have across the state and across all different types of sectors. And therefore, I think it's really important that as we're looking at this demand management feasibility investigation, that we consider all the potential tools that help us maintain compliance with the compact, especially those that may have additional benefits across the state. That's part of what we're here to do today, is identify those potential multi-purpose benefits and the trade-offs that Dan mentioned. We'll go through the framework concept today that staff and the consultant team have been working on, with the ultimate goal of using that framework as a tool for discussion to identify those potential trade-offs, as well as the equity issues, potential impacts, available mitigation options, and ultimately use this workshop to help the board determine whether demand management is achievable, worthwhile, and advisable from Colorado's perspective. And when we say Colorado, we mean all of Colorado and all sectors of Colorado, all corners of Colorado, all the people of Colorado. So I really look forward to diving in with everyone that's on, and I will be here. Thank you, and I'll turn it over to Amy, Amy and Greg, who really are the experts in this.
Thank you so much, Director Gibbs and Director Mitchell. I'm just going to make sure I have control of the screen. Oh, Vivian, I might need some help here. Well, I think that Director Gibbs and Director Mitchell really framed things up really well, and offered some really good reminders for us today. The first of which is, this is a board workshop. We're not here today for you all to make any particular findings or to make decisions, really just to work through a lot of these really complex issues in greater detail than a typical board meeting would allow us to. So that being said, I do want to kind of honor that workshop format, and if at any point you want to step in and ask questions, feel free to do so. That's why we're here today. So with that, I'll turn to the agenda and just kind of briefly give you an idea of what we're going to go over today. The real goal today is to look at the framework, to look at work that we've been doing along with the consultant team on building out that framework that we introduced back at the January board meeting. And noting the January board meeting, there are going to be some things that we covered there that we're going to go over again today, but what I'm hoping is that we can kind of show you some of the progress we've made in those areas, but also, again, introduce you to the additional subject matters that we've started working on in the framework as well. So again, this kind of lays out how we're going to go about it. We do have a break built in at 2:15. And then we also have a decent amount of time just for discussion of next steps, and also kind of discussion of the big picture of how this might all come together and where we see it going from here. One other thing I'll note is that we have Sarah Leonard, who will be presenting along with me, Greg, and Michelle today. And I think that I'm really excited to have her here because she, as our marketing and communications director, is really the expert on education outreach, engagement, all of that stuff. So I think that she'll be able to explain kind of the education outreach elements of the framework, but also the next steps as far as engagement on this go better than we could have. So I'm really happy to have her here with us today. So I did just want to start with a really brief kind of reminder of the key elements of the work plan that we're operating under. This is a work plan that you adopted in November of 2020. And one thing I always like to point out is this reiteration of that 2018 support and policy statement. There were a lot of good things that came out of that. It feels like a long time ago now, but I always think it's good to remind people that that is fully incorporated in this work plan. So the issues of equity, proportionality, those commitments that this board made are still carrying forward. And I just think that's an important reminder to start with. And second, the overarching goals, the achievability, is it worthwhile for Colorado, and advisability. And I'm going to talk about that just a little bit more in a little bit. And then engagement process, we have, I think, a lot more to discuss with you today on that piece of it. This goes back to kind of the ultimate goal here, which is to run through this framework with you all and really get to a point where we're comfortable, where you all are comfortable with us really kind of engaging the public on this framework and having some more substantive discussions about potential program designs. And then finally, of course, the key elements of the work plan, the work that we're actually doing. And we're here really today to focus on the framework. So this is another slide you saw back in January, but I just want to show it again to kind of show where we are in implementing this. The work plan was adopted in November. Kind of showed you some preliminary concepts of what we're working on in January, and this is kind of our opportunity to flesh that out in greater detail before we start that iterative review process across the state. So, again, this is a slide that I think I show in pretty much every demand management presentation I give, no matter where, because I think that these are just really important reminders for everyone to have and those listening in. Demand management is not a foregone conclusion. There's still a lot that would need to be done to set up a demand management program. And particularly relating to this stage in the feasibility investigation, I want to be very clear that the framework is not a demand management program. That's not what we're doing here. We are not here today to have you all adopt a framework structure and sign off on exactly what a demand management program would look like. This is really designed to be a tool for discussion and to move this process forward. The other thing that I think it's important to reiterate again is that if a program is established, it will be run by the state for the benefit of the whole state and its water users. Throughout this process, again, that collaborative, open, transparency, all of those things are important. I know I did not articulate that very well, but we're committed to continuing to do this in a collaborative and transparent manner. And ongoing engagement with the tribal nations is also really important here. So as we kind of roll out the framework and the various options that we've put together, there are some things that underlie all of it, and these are included among those things. So I just kind of wanted to reiterate those. Now, to revisit the framing of the feasibility analysis, I think that you all are fairly familiar with this, but I think it's just a good place to start to kind of frame up what we're going to be talking about today. The Step 2 work plan really designates three key kind of questions that are all part of the feasibility analysis. First question is achievability. And that is really focused on the question of, can we create a demand management program pursuant to the terms of the demand management storage agreement? Is it possible to do that? The next question is it worthwhile for Colorado? And I've been referring to this as, is it palatable from a state perspective? So even if we can do it, should we do it? Can we design a program in a way that, for example, is not going to create negative impacts, or that we'll fully address them? That's the kind of question that goes into that second box there. And I think a lot of what you'll see in the framework is in that second box. So showing potential program design, showing how this could all play out, the question becomes, okay, is that palatable? Is that, can we accept that? Is that good for the state if we design a program like that? And finally, the question of advisability. And this really comes as a third step after those first two questions are answered. I view this as kind of a point in time question. So in other words, maybe we've determined that demand management is achievable, it is palatable, it's worthwhile from the state's perspective. But then the ultimate question is, how does it fit in, for example, with the state's other budget priorities at that moment in time? And that's obviously an evolving situation, maybe more so now than ever has been. So is demand management the appropriate tool to consider at this time? That's kind of the question that we're looking at there, but that's not really on the table today. I think we're really focused on those first two questions with the framework. So I'm going to hand it over to Sarah Leonard in a little bit to get us started walking through all these elements. But first, I just wanted to explain again kind of how we're going about thinking about this framework and how we're putting it together. So again, the ultimate goal here is to show potential demand management program designs and then initiate this iterative discussion across the state about what might work, what might not work, and ultimately whether demand management is feasible, whether it's, again, achievable and worthwhile. So how did we get there, and how are we actually building this and putting it together? Well, we started with all the work that came out of the 2019 work plan, all the work groups that were meeting really diligently through that really open collaborative process. They were tasked with identifying the key threshold issues associated with the demand management program. So we've really taken all the great work that those work groups did. We've worked with the consultant team, and we've kind of used that material to identify the elements of feasibility that kind of come out of that from the perspective of each work group. So you're going to see this play out with each of the work group subject matters as we go through them. But ultimately, our goal was to use those elements of feasibility and present a range of options for implementation. So in other words, if we take this one particular issue that this work group was focused on, maybe it's how are we monitoring and verifying ag participation, in a demand management program. We are then looking at a full range of implementation options from A to B to C. And what you'll see, and we talked about this again briefly in January, is that they do range roughly in terms of complexity. And so A is maybe the least complex option, and then C is maybe the most complex option. We wanted to be really careful not to say, A is the low option, B is the medium, C is the high, specifically because the whole purpose is to identify trade-offs. So from one perspective, it might be that C is a great option, but maybe when you add up the costs associated with it, or when you look at other impacts that might occur, it's not as great from someone else's perspective or from the perspective of a particular sector. So the purpose here is really to, again, show that full range so that we can start to identify those trade-offs. And underlying all of this is equity, is the question of, in practice, is this fair? Is it proportional? Does it work? Does it strike us as fair from our state perspective? So IVCC, of course, operated as kind of a de facto additional work group. We don't have them represented in the same way that we have all the work groups presented, because I think what we realize is that equity really underlies a lot of these things. So what we've done is really identify the equity issues, the trade-offs, and those types of things associated with each of these options as we go through them. So what is our kind of goal here? First, I think today we really want to, again, just go through each of these subject matters with you in greater detail and get some input and feedback on what you think of it. Is this tracking with how you viewed this framework playing out? That's a question. And once we've kind of gone through all the substantive material, I think it leads to the next question of how would this all fit together? So what kind of program structures might we be looking at when we kind of combine a lot of these things together? And again, what we want to do today is get to a point where maybe we have some feedback that we're going to incorporate. Maybe we are tweaking some things, but we're, getting to the point where we're ready to initiate that iterative discussion across the state. We're ready to really share this broadly and start asking people what strikes them as fair and what isn't as fair. So one thing that I will note at this point is that we do not have law and policy and administration and accounting represented in this. I know that they're here. We wanted to kind of show all the work groups. But since those two elements in particular are very, I think, responsive to other elements of the framework and don't exactly fit the structure that we're using for the others, we will not include them in the framework, but we will kind of address issues as they come up as the framework is developing. So I just wanted to clarify that point. Again, the implementation options, I just want to be really clear. This is a range of options. So it might be that someone sees option A, maybe some work group members see option A associated with their work group and they're like, no, that was not our recommendation. That's not how we think demand management should be playing out. And I want to be very clear that this is not designed to show in any way what an ideal program should look like. It's designed to show a full range of options so that we can get closer to identifying what people might want to see in a demand management program and what might not work. So it's that the purpose is exactly to spur that type of discussion, to hear people say, oh no, actually that's not going to work from our perspective. So hopefully we can kind of start to identify some areas of agreement. Maybe a lot of people across the state feel this particular element will work really well. Maybe a lot of people feel this one we need to trash. And, maybe we can start to narrow in, I guess, on things that we think might work or things that we think might not work. So that's kind of the goal and how things are going to be represented here. And again, I noted earlier that there are some key assumptions underlying all of these. And I went through kind of the principles, but these are kind of the nuts and bolts of, again, how the consistent things that will be true about any implementation option or any potential demand management program. One, be run, managed, regulated by the state and or UCRC. Second, it's bound by the Demand Management Storage Agreement. That's the shortest bullet here, but probably the most complex. There are a lot of provisions there, notably the 500,000 acre foot cap that we have on the demand management storage pool. So the assumption is that everything that we're looking at would comply with that agreement. And the next, all projects would be reviewed to ensure compliance with applicable federal and state laws, interstate agreements, and existing programs and processes. As we were working through this framework, there were various points where we wanted to say, maybe option A is we're going to make sure it complies with everything we need it to comply with, but that's the assumption for everything here. So we just wanted to make that really clear. And again, ongoing coordination with tribal nations is going to be important going forward. So we don't have a specific part of the framework that addresses that because that's an underlying assumption no matter how we do it. So a couple notes just briefly before I hand it over to Sarah to really get into the framework on the order that we're doing this in. So it's not alphabetical order. It might strike you as kind of an odd order, but there's a method to the madness here. So we're going to start with education and outreach. And then we're going to go to monitoring and verification and environmental considerations. Then we'll go to economic impacts and ag impacts. And finally, we'll end with process considerations and funding. The reason we're doing that is because some of those work groups just seemed to make sense together. For example, monitoring and verification and environmental considerations. There are a lot of technical issues that go into that. They also impact each other a lot. So if we're looking at potential environmental options to coordinate environmental benefits, that has some implications for monitoring and verification, for example. Same can be said of economic impacts and agricultural impacts. I think we saw a lot of overlap in those two groups, particularly in terms of what are the potential impacts that we might see from a demand management program? What are appropriate strategies to mitigate those? And what's the appropriate role for local governments, communities to get involved and kind of guide that process? And then finally, we'll get into process considerations and funding. We were kind of thinking of this as process considerations. I first want to point out was not a work group, but as we were going through this, it became clear that there were just, some random or kind of important process implications that kind of came out of it, that fell out of it, that didn't fit specifically in a work group. But funding, we have as the final subject matter today, because the way that we kind of tried to do this was, so if you add up everything that we're seeing, for example, in an A-type program, this is the bottom line. This is what it might cost. So that's really responsive to all the other elements of the framework. So that's kind of why we did it in the order we did. Education and outreach is what we're going to start out with. It didn't necessarily have a natural coupling with another work group, but kind of underlies everything we're doing. It's going to be really, really important if a program is implemented. And it's also really important just as we continue the feasibility investigation. So we put that first. And with that, I think I'm going to go ahead and hand it off to Sarah to take us through the education and outreach element of this.
Thanks, Amy. Can you hear me okay? All right.
I can.
Great. Okay, so the education and outreach work group, I think everyone here knows that it was a little bit more unique because it was twofold. Members discussed education and outreach needs more broadly in terms of what would be needed for an actual program, for an actual demand management program. However, it's the nature of communications and marketing that it's easier to create a communications plan once we actually have a program in place or a project in place. So we, of course, don't have one in place right now that we, have an idea of yet. So secondly, the work group also focused some of its discussion on education outreach needs in the context of the feasibility investigation and its stakeholder and public engagement process. So for this part of the presentation, we'll focus on the education outreach work groups identified principles and implementation ideas for if a program was actually set up. And then a little bit later today, I'll circle back with you when we discuss the next steps, and we can focus on the current planning efforts we have for outreach during the feasibility investigation portion. So the work group identified 4 goals listed here on the slide, or guiding principles for a demand management program. 1, there must be a transparent and inclusive stakeholder engagement process to shape the program. And we can close the communication gap by using consistent messaging, bringing together partners into a network, and allowing for virtual engagement opportunities as well. We can implement general water education at the state, regional, and local levels to make sure everyone has the opportunity to learn water basics and create a foundation for what is an important, broad, and complex topic, as well as other complicated water topics. And finally, we can include an equity lens in all of our engagement and communications tactics. And Amy, can we go to slide 2? Thanks. So with those 4 goals in mind that we just discussed, the work group identified 3 elements of feasibility that could be used for implementation of tactics. The first is water education, which is meant to engage a wider range of publics. This element is aimed at increasing general understanding of water processes and issues across the state to all who are interested. It's important to have that foundational knowledge in order to understand demand management and other complicated water issues. And so to do this, the state could expand its website or create a new website to house resources. We are able to issue press releases and public notices, and we can do all of these things right now, but enhance the process by also delegating tasks to some of our water partners who have broader, more diverse audiences, as well as coordinate joint efforts with those partners. We could also increase staff and travel resources to pursue more strategic, tailored teaching to various publics across the state. And this too would require additional partner resources and assistance. And it's important to know that a variety of these different partners is needed to ensure that we reach more diverse constituents as well. The second element, stakeholder engagement, is obtaining a range of input to help shape the program based on needs across the state. For this element, we can use and build upon existing programs and platforms with, of course, input from our board and the IBCC members, potentially with assistance from a consultant as well. And we can lead the public engagement process through public meetings, again, leveraging our partners to bring folks together. And finally, the more time and resources that we put into the engagement strategy, the more tailored and extensive these meetings can be. So the final point also brings in the equity concern as well, as some groups or areas across the state will likely require more time and resources than others. So is that fair or not is the question. And then of course, element 3 is program marketing, which is to ensure we have participation across the state. And some of the marketing tactics include just the state's continued involvement in existing water forums, events, conferences, meetings, and making sure that we share program information to those existing and active water groups. But we could also more proactively market by partnering with local water and other groups across the state, relying on them to help promote our collateral and resources for the program that would be in place. And finally, a more directed approach could be actually opening local offices to ensure that we are maximizing participation by being a little bit more on the ground and managing information sharing firsthand, the state, that is. And then if we go to slide 3, or my slide 3, it's not slide 3. Here is just a picture of the education outreach portion of your framework matrix that you already have. So just to note again that I just provided an overview of all of the implementation options, but they're actually split up into the various categories that Amy discussed a moment ago. So that also includes issues and equity considerations in that last column there. So just something to note that that's all kind of broken up. But yeah, that is an overview of the education outreach work group discussions that have happened. Amy, anything else I'm missing?
No, I think you did a great job covering it, Sarah. And I just thought we could kind of pause here and maybe see what people think about this. I know that it is a lot of information. This is something that we did cover in January, but thought it would be good to go over it again and see what people think, if there's any feedback that you'd like to provide. All of this material is in the packet that you received. It's the same thing that's reflected here. So just for your information. Yeah, so I guess one thing that I will note just briefly before we see if there are any questions or discussion points is that that I should have noted earlier is all of the information we're presenting here is at a certain level of generality. So it's not as detailed as it might be. And really the goal will be, once we kind of have the structure in place, we can actually start to develop more detail in these, whether that's from input that you provide us, or we can go, as we're discussing this across the state, people might have specific ideas about here's how you could maybe implement that idea that you have, for example, in B of education and outreach, stakeholder engagement, or things like that. So I did just want to point that out, but now maybe we'll just open it to any questions or thoughts that you all might have. I'm seeing a question from Director Felt. Do you want just questions on the education piece, or are you open to questions regarding introduction? Yeah, any questions you have are great. I think on the introduction or the education outreach, I would save questions on other work group material until we get to those work groups, but yeah, whatever you have on what we've presented so far.
Maybe I'll just go ahead and ask a question, Amy. And forgive me if this has been covered a long time ago, but when you're talking about achievability and advisability and whether this is worthwhile for Colorado, beneath the worthwhile or in the worthwhile box, it had something to the effect of, is there a net benefit for Colorado? And I'm not clear what that means in this context where we're contemplating maybe a net negative impact due to compact curtailment. So, I mean, where are you starting from, I guess, when you talk about a net benefit? Are we talking about getting back to zero? Or are we trying to actually somehow improve upon where we are right now?
That is a really, really good question. And I think kind of gets at the heart of, what a purpose of a demand management program would be, which is to avoid curtailment. So I think it does make sense to consider these options in contrast to a potential curtailment scenario. And it's hard to know what that might look like and how that would play out across the state, across the basin, and all of that. So I understand it's kind of a difficult comparison. But I guess what I would say is it does make sense to think about that, to have that in the back of your mind. And to also think about, the potential for that. So it might be that never happens. That's a possibility even without a demand management program. But it's also the whole reason it's in the DCP is because we saw, given the hydrology, that things might become more challenging in the future. So I guess that was a really long-winded way of saying, I think it's completely fair to compare this against the threat of a potential curtailment scenario.
So just to follow up, I guess then, I mean, one sense that I've been getting in some of the conversations that I've listened to or even been involved in is, I think some of the time there's a sentiment about demand management that's kind of expressed as, well, what's in it for me, or what's in it for my group, and as if there is a potential net benefit above and beyond maintaining the status quo. And I mean, I guess maybe that's only natural that everybody, tries to figure out if there's somehow an angle that is above and beyond just maintaining where we are. But that's what kind of led to my question, is I've been sensing that at times. And then when you had the net benefit built right into that first or second slide, I wasn't clear if we were hoping for something beyond just maintaining what we have right now. So
I do, one thing I should add is that I think there's potential recognized that an appropriately designed demand management program could offer, ensure ongoing compact compliance while also offering, environmental benefits, recreational benefits, economic benefits. So I think, there's maybe an open question as to the extent of what could be realized there. While, keeping in mind that the ultimate goal and the whole purpose of a program would be to ensure compliance with the compact. And that's kind of the starting point for it.
Great. Okay. Thank you.
Of course. Director Brown, did you have a comment?
I was muted, so I was the one for the day. You're welcome. Get that out of the way. My comment is that I really like the idea of the local offices. I think it's something that you've taken and built off of conversations, even outside the demand management one. And I really appreciate you including it. And as we talk about both demand management and other potential solutions and options to deal with the drought on the Colorado River system, I think that considering local offices as liaisons is a really good concept. And I just wanted to commend you for including that in there. So thank you.
Thank you.
Oops, did not mean to skip to the next slide. Sorry about that. But that this does highlight that what we're going to hear next is about monitoring verification. Michelle Garrison will present on that. But first, I let me see if I can just go back. Because I do, if there are things that people feel are missing here, or any other suggestions or questions or discussion points, definitely want to hit on them before we move on. I'm not seeing anything. Is anyone else? Nope. Okay. In that case, maybe we will go ahead and move forward to monitoring and verification. Michelle, if you're ready to take it away here.
All right, thanks, Amy. So I apologize, some of you have heard this before because we presented this as kind of an idea of where we were going in a previous meeting. So apologies for the redundancy, but we'll repeat it again here because we have a slightly different audience. So to remind everybody, the monitoring and verification work group goals were that the monitoring and verification process should be as honest, accurate, and defensible as possible. It should be protective of other water users, and it should be as simple, easy, and flexible as possible while still meeting the first two goals. And then that participation should add water to the Colorado River Basin. So a reminder that for this particular effort, we are trying to have all projects result in wet water should we, stand up a program at some point in the future. There might be other projects that have a lot of benefits, but a key goal for this one would be actually adding extra water to the Colorado River Basin. Next slide, please. So the elements of feasibility that we took from the discussions the monitoring and verification work group had, those discussions kind of split into a couple of different pieces. And here we've broken them into agricultural projects, trans-mountain projects, and coordination with other benefits. I just wanted to mention briefly, we did talk about a few types of projects, including industrial, that aren't specifically mentioned here, but as we talked about them, we felt like they fell into one of these two categories, depending on the location and type of project. So while we call them agricultural and trans-mountain, these were meant to be all-encompassing of any type of project we could envision might be part of a possible future program. So for agricultural projects, the elements of feasibility that the work group dug into included measurement of water return to the stream, consumptive use analysis, estimate of residual field consumptive use and how that relates to the estimate of conserved consumptive use, and maintenance of return flows. For trans-mountain projects, the elements that were determined were measurement of water return to stream and a verification of conserved consumptive use, however that might occur, and we'll talk about a little bit about the details of that on the next slide. And finally, coordination with other benefits and the things that might be done, particularly with the trans-mountains, but maybe for all of them, in looking at whether or not other benefits could be derived based on timing or other factors of the measurement and verification of consumptive use. Next slide, please. So for monitoring verification, you guys have seen most of this slide before, maybe without the right-hand side, interconnected issues, trade-offs, and equity considerations. So we'll spend a little more time on those today than just reading the table, perhaps like we did before. But so for the major agricultural project elements, for measuring water return to the stream, as you look from left to right, less complexity to more complexity, the less complex would be that you're able to bypass the diversions in a place where it's easy to determine or to make some simple estimates and then proceed without direct measurement. More complex would be that you're going to divert it and measure it and then return it to the stream simply, something like a flume. And then most complex would be that it requires a more sophisticated set of devices, real-time recording devices, telemetry, something. And some complicated systems already have this, others don't. And so the scale and the complexity of what might be needed for monitoring and verification might require additional equipment. In regards to the issues, they wanted to point out that if you keep it simpler, you may have to be more conservative in your estimates. So you may get less credit overall for how much water was actually produced, to make sure that those simpler estimates are protective of other water users. And so that's one of the trade-offs that, important trade-offs that was identified here. In terms of conducting a consumptive use analysis here, the work group was comprised of a lot of people who had a lot of expertise in the way these things are currently done for substitute water supply plans, water court cases, and other things. And so you'll see that reflected in this table. And this line is one of them where the simplest might be that you use an existing tool like the Division of Water Resources least fallow tool to estimate historical consumptive use. And again, if you're going to do that, most likely you would have to be conservative to be protective of other users when you make those more general calculations. Or you go a little more site specific, but using data that's already readily available, looks more like a substitute water supply plan, not identical to, but something like, or a complete detailed site specific engineering analysis that might look more like some of the water court change cases that some people have seen. In terms of estimating the residual field consumptive use, the simplest is when you're doing complete fallowing and you're just doing management practices to take care of any weeds and other things that might result in any accidental, incidental consumptive use. As projects get more complicated, you're likely to need to have some sort of measurement or computation of actual consumptive use and conserved consumptive use as reflected there. And so I think another trade-off there is that this mentioned on the side is we've done these by level of complexity, and it doesn't speak to whether or not individual projects, not a program, but individual projects might require a higher level of complexity. And so if the program is open to all, does that impact what you would think about in a program in terms of complexity for some of these technical issues? And finally, the maintenance of return flows. Again, the simplest would be you bypass diversions right at the point, and you don't take into consideration any return flows, possibly because they're at a location where it's not important. More complicated is you develop some unit response functions to try to make sure you're taking care of that maintenance the maintenance of return flows, or finally, again, a more site-specific study and perhaps more instrumentation upon something like we've seen in some of the more complex water court change cases and in areas where water administration is currently very, very tight, different than in locations where maybe that return flow isn't an impact so much to downstream users. So those are the important ones. And of course, the more complicated you make it, probably the longer it takes to look at all of these things when you're looking at proposals. So you could be looking at extra expense and extra time to review proposals and figure these things out, but in return for maybe perhaps being more protective of other water users. And finally, a nod to the fact that all of these things would also require consultation with the state engineer's office and a determination of what would be feasible at that location, given all the considerations at that time. Next slide, please. So for Trans Mountain projects, again, very important for the measurement of water return to stream and verifying conserved consumptive use. So measurement of water return to the stream looks very same in terms of simple to more complex with similar trade-offs. In terms of verifying conserved consumptive use, every one of the projects people kind of thought about as to how they might be able to participate in something like demand management. It was very clear that every one of these systems is very, very different. And so the group had a lot of discussion about how it works with all these different systems to try to figure out a way to verify conserved consumptive use, so that you've come up with some bars to set in terms of comfort level, but still leaving the entity that wants to participate the ability to provide that verification of conserved consumptive use in a way that fits with the complicated systems that they're running. And so that's what you'll see here in terms of how the participant might provide some accounting and exactly what types of things they have to show in terms of whether or not they took water from another piece of their system, or to prove that this actually put more water onto the west slope in some way. And again, similar trade-offs and similar equity considerations in terms of whether or not any interested participant, no matter how complicated their system, might be able to participate if there were a program. Next slide, please. And finally, and we didn't talk as much about this one before, and this time we've actually rolled some of the environmental considerations up into here just because the two rows were starting to look very much alike. So this is also an introduction to the next section, which is environmental considerations. But for some projects, particularly projects that have access to storage, there was a lot of talk about whether or not there could be some coordination in timing and other things to provide extra benefits from that project. And so in terms of simplest to most complex, we're looking at maybe a qualitative demonstration of some benefits and an increase in stream flow at a particular time of year with no additional measurement. As you get more complex, maybe qualitatively looking at the type of storage that was available and the timing of the releases of the water that was conserved and what benefits might have accrued due to that timing. And as you go to the more complex, then quantitatively measuring all of those things in more detail. Again, anytime you're looking at storage, then you're also looking at decrees and other things and needing to be working with the state engineer's office on what might work. So this was just a general concept of whether or not additional benefits might be provided to the environment and possibly others as you're tracking these releases of conserved consumptive use from storage. Next slide, please. So environmental considerations. The work group goals from this work group included, yes.
I'm really sorry.
Stop and take questions first?
I was wondering if we should, I think it might make sense just to pause after each work group to take questions and discussion on that particular work group. Sorry.
Nope, that makes sense.
Director Hawkins, would you like to jump in?
Yeah, thanks, Michelle. That was really helpful. I'm having a little bit of a hard time understanding where big ditch companies or Western Slope water users that partially rely on federal storage contracts fit here. I don't see them quite fitting in the ag verification seems very specific to a direct diversion. And then that last point on environmental benefits, that's the timing question, but do we have clarity on what happens with a big ditch company with lots of shares that may have a package of direct diversion and storage water and what that looks like here?
So it's not reflected well in these tables in terms of the amount of effort you would go into for monitoring and verification, but it was a big part of the discussions of the work groups that a lot of these projects aren't simple. They're complicated. The projects themselves, the folks that might want to participate might have very complicated projects that are a combination of direct flow rights and storage and other things. And I would say even in the System Conservation Pilot Program, we found those questions to be much more difficult to address. Particularly the System Conservation Pilot Program was a very short-term program. And so we didn't have time to address some things ahead of time, which meant if you were considering that project for a particular year, you didn't have time to address all of that. And you had to kind of see what the proposal was and whether or not you thought it would work, but you also weren't doing that same level of accounting either. And so I think that would need to be addressed. And as we talked about things like maintenance of return flows, I think in that section, it applies very specifically that for any project, there would have to be a review of all the details of that system, if it's part of a system, and how that would work and whether or not there are specific return flow obligations and how they would have to be met, for instance. Outside of the questions of for any of those projects, and I think this will come up more, and again, maybe not in this table, but the way we've been thinking about the consultations with local governmental entities about some of these projects. If you're in a big ditch system, the CWCB doesn't fully understand all of the rules and how your shares work and everything else. If there's a proposal to come out of one of those systems, I think that would require consultation with the folks that run that system to understand whether or not that proposal might work and how it might work. And so you'll see a little bit of that detailed in the local government piece, but again, we haven't fleshed that out entirely. But I think on a lot of levels, we have a lot of different complicated projects. So I think back to the hypotheticals too, that this work group put together that are not incorporated in this table, but the work group came up with some pretty complicated hypotheticals that look to this. And I think for the other questions in terms of outreach to local governments and stuff, again, it's complicated and we need to fold that in as we think about what a possible program might look like. Did that address your question, or do you have more specific?
No, I think on both sides, this is going to be pretty important to folks in the Southwest. I think they're going to want to know both what it looks like if they participate, but also what it looks like if they don't participate, and they're wondering about impacts. And I feel like what we have here maybe doesn't quite get at some of the pretty, I think, common storage and consolidated ditch company or water conservation district setups that we have, at least in my basin. I'll let the other directors comment on theirs. And I think we'll want to make sure we capture input on that.
Good point. Let me know if you, I'm sorry, who did I interrupt? I was just going to say, let me know if you think it would be helpful if we looked back at some of those hypotheticals and maybe included them in addition, like if we try to incorporate them here in the matrix, or if we include them in addition when we're talking about these pieces, that we have these hypotheticals that are more complicated, that allowed at least this work group to talk through how that might look. And so we have a couple of different ways we could approach that if you want to give us some recommendations on how you would like that incorporated.
And Michelle, I was actually just going to say pretty much exactly what you did, that we have these hypotheticals that have already been developed and we can build upon. And we were kind of struggling with how that fits in here because we were kind of trying to capture things on a pretty high level and not exactly dive into very specific types of projects, but while at the same time recognizing we have to have an understanding of how very specific elements will work. So that's all to say, we can find an appropriate place to kind of fit those hypotheticals in. And I also think this does, as Michelle was alluding to, really directly relate to the consultation elements that we're going to talk about in a little bit. What level of consultation do we really need in a program to make sure that we are tracking those very local issues and maybe impacts? And how can we kind of make sure that that input is incorporated into a program? So I think these are really good points, and I think we can, as we move through this, think about the best way to kind of capture that type of information.
I know we have others that when I say something, I would say that I would look at the slide on we're on the environmental and other co-benefits, the ag slide. I would ask you to review it. It appeared to me as if it was very specific to direct diversions. And maybe that's the guidance I can give you today, is let's not create confusion if other people read it as I did.
We'll definitely.
I think that's.
Sorry, go ahead, Michelle.
I think that's important, and I think we rolled some of the storage up a little bit into this coordinated benefits, and maybe we should pull it out a little bit more. So we can do that. There was definitely discussion in the work group about that could be incorporated more directly if we need to specify that a little better in the matrix.
And I think Director Schwartz was next in line maybe for a comment, and then Director Brown after that.
Thank you. And just a question. I wonder if any of our ATM tools could be helpful here. I mean, have you looked at, again, some of the tools we've looked at is we've watched people in different ditch systems participate in ATM projects. Do you see any overlap and any opportunities there?
I would say yes, we do. At least one of the ATM tools is directly mentioned in the matrix as a possible solution in the simplest box when we're trying to keep things simple, looking at some of the tools that have already been used. We have also been talking about the existing ATM projects in regards to the literature review that is still ongoing, and making sure that all of the things we've learned and the tools that have been put together are incorporated in that literature review, and in a way where everything we've learned and everything that could be useful ends up, summarized somewhere, and perhaps in the matrix as well.
I think Director Brown, I see you next here in the chat.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I think you spoke to this broader question that I have, Amy, when we first got started, but this particular group triggers the legal question, like the lack of the legal framework here, because I could potentially see, any one of A, B, or C being needed depending on the diversion or the applicant into this program. And so I guess my question, and I haven't totally thought through it, so I'll just, excuse my lack of eloquence as I ask it, is, do you see this as, this is going to need a lot more work in order to understand if one applicant, I'm sorry, I wish I could say this more clear. If one applicant applies for this program and it triggers like the C column, right? Because their neighbor just believes that there is an injury issue there, is that, that project is going to become more and more expensive in order to put into the demand management program as a general rule. So when we look at this, to me, like, this is one of the most important aspects of this program. I think everything we talk about sort of comes down to us being able to monitor and verify this water in a meaningful and, honest, accurate, all of the things that you're saying, but especially that there is a do no harm or no injury question that's clearly answered and agreed upon. I don't know if this is really a question, but am I missing something here? Do you see the complexity that I do, or do you have do you want to stop my rambling, say something more effective?
No, you're not rambling at all. This was talked about a lot by the work group, because you could envision certain projects just needing that higher level of complexity. And yet I think the group landed on, if it could be simpler, maybe that would be better. But the question of, can it be simpler, has to be taken to a larger group in terms of comfort. If we were to use a simpler tool, how conservative would that tool have to be? Would you want to put in some sort of safety factor that would give a local non-participant comfort that they weren't being injured? And how big would that have to be? And then would it still be worthwhile to try to aim for that simpler method, or would everyone be better off if you went to the more complex method? And the group didn't land in any particular place, but they did talk about the trade-offs and the fact that if you go simpler, you may have to put in some safety factors there that would cost you in terms of the amount of water you got credit for. So simpler monitoring and verification might mean you take credit for less water to make sure other users are protected, and you're being very conservative in your estimates of consumptive use.
Sure. And maybe part of the question and why the legal work group, you know, the lack of us, and I understand why not having a table for them, is the dispute resolution angle of this. So, you know, if there is an appeals process, if we're relying on some sort of water court process, and as you know, Gail mentioned, the ATM program tools that have been legislated over the years, you know, a lot of comfort comes from the water community around having that water court process. But I could just see this just becoming hugely expensive if that is the process for anyone that wants to, you know, disagree with an application. And I guess I bring this up too because in the Yampa, we just have a different system happening here because we're not under administration all the time. And so when you start to go towards a more complex plumbing model, there's going to be more questions answered, and maybe people totally different than what happens on the South Platte. They have to get their comfort level now up to that administrative world that they're not familiar with. Plus, they're getting comfortable with this new program and this new demand on the system. So it's certainly not something we can solve today, but maybe something that we should think about is just what that dispute resolution process looks like and flag it for conversation to reoccur as we go through this program or framework, excuse me.
I think that's an excellent suggestion. And I think it speaks also again to that local outreach and consultation piece as well. And I think we still have a lot of work to do to try to understand just the full scale of what that might have to look like to have people be comfortable with certain aspects of the program, including, as you said, monitoring and verification. So I think those are great points.
It looks like Director Brody was next in the chat.
Thank you, Amy and Michelle. I'm glad you started with kind of these two program elements. I think they're hugely important to the success of the program in a couple of respects. Number one, I think it's important that we do everything we can to be transparent, 100% transparent. You know, as you both point out, there isn't necessarily a right or wrong or a one-size-fits-all solution in terms of monitoring and verification, but I do think it's important that we be transparent about whatever assumptions we're making that go into, you know, whatever determinations, you know, may get made under this program in terms of how much credit someone gets or water user gets, and that we recognize that there may be a need for some flexibility, but at the same time, we need to be, you know, very upfront about how we're making those decisions and how we're crediting different waters that are contributed to the program. In terms of program outreach and education too, I mean, again, I think it's important that we meet people where they're at, and that we really work hard to build that trust. To me, this is sort of like a huge change management effort. You know, this is a fundamentally different way of thinking about how we use water and allocate water, potentially move water around and conserve water for the betterment of our state. And it's important that we really think about this, at least in my mind, as a change management process that, you know, it isn't a one-shot deal. It's something that's going to be ongoing. We're not going to get it perfect out of the gate. if we go forward with a program, we need to constantly be open to, revisiting our approaches, figuring out what's not working as well as it could, and learning as we go and getting better as we go. And so I think of this sort of the monitoring and verification and the outreach and education as sort of an ongoing cycle of, we try something, we get feedback, we figure out how we make it better, we try something a little bit different. And so I'm glad you're thinking about these issues and sort of putting these front of mind.
I will just note briefly, Director Brody, that that exact process is envisioned in one of the economic impacts local government options. So we'll talk through that a little bit more, but that idea of really an evolving program and, kind of having the iterative process where we are learning what's working and what's not and adapting the program as we go forward. And all the kind of issues associated with that is exactly the type of thing that is raised in the economic impacts local government material as well. So we'll have a bit more discussion about that. I don't see any other questions or comments at this time. So maybe we could go ahead and move on to environmental considerations. But of course we can take any other questions as they come up as well. So I'll hand it back over to you, Michelle.
All right, thanks. So the environmental considerations work group establishes their goals, achieve net environmental benefit over time and across different hydrologic conditions and geographies, provide opportunities for projects with net environmental benefits, do not harm the environment, evaluate project environmental benefits and impact without creating an unnecessarily burdensome process, and to identify project benefits and impacts to environmental resources. Next slide, please. So the elements of feasibility as we put them in the table, first is consideration of potential environmental benefits and impacts, and how would the program try to look at those potential benefits and impacts. Second, assessment of net benefit or impact. Third, strategies to incentivize benefits. And fourth, strategies to avoid, offset, or mitigate negative impacts. And I think you'll see in a couple of the rows in the table that some of these strategies kind of do both. So you'll see some duplication or merging of those two ideas in terms of trying to get the most benefits or the least impacts. You might be using those same strategies. Next slide, please. So in terms of how you might consider environmental benefits and impacts of a proposed project, simplest would be that you consider those environmental impacts and benefits in terms of flow, affected habitat, affected species, and alignment with other plans, efforts, or processes through some existing review processes and frameworks. So things you might already be looking at for other programs you would use to think about environmental benefits and impacts of proposed projects. More complex or more effort would be to look at potential projects in kind of a qualitative fashion in terms of identifying the potential environmental benefits and impacts and associated risks for particular projects, and generally the possibility of realizing some benefits and mitigating some potential impacts. And then more complex might be that you go through a much more detailed process with a comprehensive list of potential benefits and impacts, and kind of check the boxes individually for each project on exactly what you think the benefits and impacts might be. Possibly engaging in a public stakeholder process and looking at consultation with local entities and experts to look at those potential benefits and impacts at the local scale for that particular project. In terms of assessing net benefit or impact, simplest, again, is you just trying to give it a quick look using existing review processes and frameworks. More effort is that you have a list of considerations that you look at qualitatively and try to assess kind of the scale of the benefits and impacts, and a qualitative evaluation of what those benefits and impacts might look like. And then more more effort, then you're trying to get a quantitative assessment of those benefits and impacts for particular projects, looking very carefully at them, looking at risks and trade-offs and numbers and things you might actually be able to do in terms of flow, I think, in terms of either achieving a net benefit or offsetting some of those impacts. And a note here on the trade-off, the more comprehensive those environmental assessments could be, that could take longer and be more of a burden to the agency, but you might be finding more opportunities for mitigation or benefits if you conduct those more detailed assessments. In terms of strategies to incentivize benefits, simplest is that the program wouldn't provide any particular incentives for projects that might have potential environmental benefits, or it gives some sort of preference or additional monetary incentive for projects that might have net environmental benefits. And finally, more comprehensively, not only might you offer some sort of incentive through the program priority or some sort of monetary incentive, but also some partnerships with NGOs and local organizations to see if partnership with other programs and agencies might allow you to achieve additional benefits. And some of the things that we've thought about in that realm could be work that's already going on, environmental work that's already going on in that area. And maybe you could be combining some of the funding and the work so that you achieve additional benefits based on that project. And again, so you'll see a little bit of that again in the local government piece. And then for strategies to avoid, offset, or mitigate negative impacts, very similar to the one for incentivizing benefits. No additional strategies is the simplest. Next would be an evaluation of the program as a whole for looking for partnerships and programs that could be combined to maximize benefits and minimize negative impacts. Some of those examples might be, again, looking at retiming of storage flows to provide more benefits. And then finally, in that more effort column, looking at specific projects and looking at specific partnerships per project to add more environmental value. And so similar to what I just talked about, looking at existing programs and existing organizations and the local needs and trying to do some partnerships for watershed restoration or improvements to diversion structures during the project so that at the end you've improved that environmental benefit through increased partnerships as the program looks at these projects. In terms of a trade-off, I think again, mostly you're looking at cost and complexity and time to review them and put these things together. If you're looking at projects out for the next year, trying to get all those correct partnerships in place would be the challenge for that highest level of effort column. Next slide, please. All right, and so I think we're ready for a break, but I'll hand it back to Amy. Or ask for questions first, I guess, on that section.
Yeah, one thing, if I can, Michelle, just add, I think that this material in particular is where we were kind of catching ourselves thinking we really need to, in the A category, state that we are maintaining compliance with existing law, compacts, all of that, and also using the existing processes and programs that are in place. So I just wanted to reiterate that that is an underlying assumption with any program implementation option here. So Director Trick looks like has a question.
Yes, thank you, Amy. Can you give an example of one of the existing review processes or frameworks here that would be used? I'm a little confused about what we're referring to there when we make that statement.
So I would say there are several ongoing programs that have already looked at some flow needs, affected habitat and species. The endangered species programs are one, but there are others. I think the Middle Colorado effort and some others where there have already been some discussions and some material put out in terms of what they think the local needs are. And so plugging into those existing programs that already have, if a project were in that area, for instance, you would automatically look at that project and the existing program that's been set up to look at the environmental needs in that area and plug into their review process or their process for ideas for next steps for local needs. I don't know if that's a great example, but that's, I think, some of what was being referred to here, is that there are already some ongoing efforts that have some sort of metric or some sort of list of things they think would be beneficial that you could compare to see if this, checks some of those boxes on an existing list of things they think additional flow in the stream might provide in that local area.
Thank you.
And it looks like Director Hawkins also has a question.
Yeah, thanks, Michelle. I've been wondering about Colorado Parks and Wildlife's review on this issue, and particularly on, whether they have an opinion on the ability to sort of manage the state's resources through drought. Have they looked at this, or is there a plan to do outreach? I think this captures sort of the potential environmental harm and benefits, but it doesn't really get at the state's interest in management of resources.
So I think there is a plan to reach out to CPW for a more comprehensive look at these things. And this is the first of several examples. I think when we get into the ag impacts, same thing, that some of these issues wouldn't be best covered by the CWCB by themselves. And the environmental one, clearly, we would need to be consulting with CPW on a regular basis. And I think in the ag impacts, we were looking at Colorado Department of Agriculture as well. There are particular boxes that I think implicate specifically working with Colorado Department of Ag. And so that's a great point. And we have not, for instance, shared this matrix with them. But as we move further into these discussions, and we talk about getting together with experts, they would certainly be on that panel, but I think even we would plan to reach out to them more specifically.
Yeah, I think that we not only can incorporate them and kind of, like the outreach or engagement efforts going forward, but also kind of similar to how we do identify the Department of Ag in the ag impacts part, maybe we could add something in this part of the framework to have that similar level of consultation reflected. I'm not seeing any other questions. We'll give people an opportunity to pipe up, but it is time for a break. We're running just a tad behind, but I wonder if we could just take a break to 2:30, if that sounds okay with everyone, 7 minutes, and reconvene at 2:30, and that'll put us on track. All right, thanks everyone. We'll see you back at 2:30.
Hey, Michelle Garrison.
Yeah.
It's Amy Beatty. Your microphone was still on and I wanted to spare you any weirdness from that.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you.
You're welcome.
You need to get to the cowbell, Amy.
I know, I need a cowbell. And also, I need, thank you, Vivian. I always manage to mess something up when I'm controlling the screen. So thank you.
You're doing great.
All right. Maybe I'll just give it one more minute for everyone to come back. Looks like people are trickling in. All right, looks like we're at 2:31, so maybe we'll go ahead and jump back in. So we are going to keep charging ahead with a few more work group subject matter areas. And we're starting to dive into the material that we did not address in the January workshop or in the January board meeting. So this will appear kind of new, just giving that quick heads up. I am going to start us off with economic impacts in local governments and then transition to the ag impacts work group. And then after that, Greg Johnson is going to come in and cover process considerations as well as the funding piece. So with that, let's go ahead and dive into economic impacts in local government. So I actually got to co-facilitate this work group along with Amy Moyer. So I'm pretty familiar with the discussions of the work group and kind of what came out of it. And what I will note at the outset is that there was the, I think, true impression that this was kind of this work group had a broad and maybe kind of nebulous scope. And I think that there was kind of a recognition of having kind of a multifaceted set of issues to deal with or to consider. One of those is municipal participation, right? How would municipalities participate? What kind of impacts might we see relating to municipal participation? So there's that part of it. But then the other thing that this work group discussed was what is the appropriate role for local governments in a potential demand management program? So in other words, whether we're talking about ag impacts or talking about dealing with very specific local issues, does local government or some form of local entity play a role in tracking those issues and kind of consulting with how to deal with them? So those are the types of issues that we're going to get into with this work group. But first, I'll just start with the overarching goals that the work group identified. One was to maintain voluntariness of a program. And I think, you know, I was joking the other day, I felt like I'd gotten maybe 15 minutes into a presentation without saying temporary, voluntary, and compensated. So I'll now made it, what, an hour and a half. But just making sure that any program is truly voluntary. The second part here is do no harm. So if we're creating a program, we don't want to harm local communities. And really, we want to create benefits where that's possible. And finally, any program should be transparent and collaborative. So with that, the elements of feasibility that we identified based on those discussions, first is support for municipal participants. So to what extent does the program envision really working with potential municipal participants to look at how they might engage in the program, what options might be available for participation, that type of thing. Next, municipal sector mitigation. And I think that there's a recognition that when it comes to the impacts of participation within a municipality, those might be somewhat unique, especially if you're looking at some kind of municipal conservation program. Are there issues that we would need to consult with the municipality to address that might occur within that municipality that might be somewhat distinct from impacts we might see from, for example, broad participation, agricultural participation in one area. So those might be somewhat distinct. And then finally, this is the other piece here, regardless of what type of participant we're talking about or what type of impact we're talking about, what role might local governments play in this program? And to what extent are we collaborating and consulting with local governments or some kind of local agency to really understand those issues and track them? So Getting into the elements of feasibility and the implementation options, as far as support for municipal participants, I do just want to kind of highlight that this is something that you'll also see in the ag impacts section of this that I'll get into in a second. But to what extent are we really working with the municipal participant and helping to identify what type of projects might work for them or what might not work for them? On the low end, there's not a lot of support in that realm. But as we work up to the C option, first of all, maybe we're playing a more active role in identifying existing programs that we might be able to coordinate with and realize some demand management water and benefits. And also working with local governments to identify appropriate mitigation opportunities. One thing to note here, I think, there's been a lot of discussion about what types of efficiency programs would or would not kind of work within the scope of a demand management program. There's that pesky temporary part of temporary, voluntary, and compensated, recognizing that efficiency programs might be the least disruptive. In what situations would that fit within a demand management program? And one thing to note here is that we can talk in Colorado about what we view and what might work, but we would also, as far as the definition of temporary goes, need to reach agreement with the other upper division states on what might count and what might not. The other thing to consider here is if there, and this really I think fits within the next part, mitigation, a little bit better, but what does it mean if a municipality is participating? Are they drawing water from other sources that might have impacts to other water users that we need to make sure that we're understanding? So then to get into municipal sector mitigation, again, this is really, I think, focused on if we have a municipality participating, are there unique issues that we might see? I remember one thing that was brought up in the work group was this concern about, if we see certain municipalities participating, do we have kind of a socioeconomic issue with lack of access to green areas? Are we, are we not going to have as many parks, things like that? So to what extent are we looking at mitigation for things like that? What can the state do? What role does the state play in really helping the municipality mitigate against things like that to the extent we see them? So again, on the A side, we assume maybe that the municipalities are taking steps to not impact their users. And maybe that ends up being the case. But through B and C, we're seeing the state more actively working with the municipalities. And in the C option, having specific protocol or mechanisms for tracking those impacts and some compensation for addressing them to the extent it's needed. And then finally, this consultation with local governments to track impacts and develop mitigation measures. I want to just clarify that this is kind of different from those first two. So this is not necessarily just focused on municipal participation. The question here is what level of consultation with local governments and communities is appropriate to make sure that the program as a whole is running as it should, to make sure that we're not seeing adverse impacts and that we're addressing them as we can. So on the A level, this kind of actually is in parallel with some of the education outreach elements that Sarah addressed, but we just kind of do our general education outreach to inform people about a potential demand management program. And there's not really a specific mechanism set up to consult with local governments to identify those potential impacts. And then in the B option, there is kind of more direct engagement with local governments. So there's a level of consultation, maybe we have developed some kind of framework for how we're going to touch base with local governments, municipalities, to talk about impacts that they might be seeing and how to address those. And then finally, C, the kind of the highest complexity option, there's actually a specific agreement, a more developed framework to facilitate a really, really robust consultation process with local governments and other entities to really make sure we're understanding the local impacts and how we might be able to address them. So of course, I think that this begs the question of, if we're not, consulting with local governments, municipalities to some extent, what issues are we going to be missing? Are we going to see some of those adverse impacts that some people are concerned about and not be able to address them proactively? Of course, I think with many of these is the case that as you work up to that higher level of complexity, it's more complex and it's going to cost more. And there's just a little bit more of a protocol to figure out in terms of how to facilitate that. So that is economic impacts in local government. And I'm going to move into the ag impacts portion in a second. But first, maybe we'll pause for comments, questions, concerns. I do want to note here that there is going to be a lot of overlap with the ag impacts work group, or at least a little bit. So I'll just kind of flag that before opening it up. So questions, thoughts, concerns?
I guess I have a question, but I'm going to ask first, when we're done with going through each of these, are we going to have sort of an open discussion time? Okay, I'll save mine. Thank you.
One thing I want to note here is that what I would envision as far as, once you all are kind of comfortable with us engaging in discussion across the state about these concepts, once we've kind of, given the head nod to this, I think that one thing that would be really helpful is to maybe really look more into, okay, what are the processes out there in place for programs kind of similar to demand management, for example? Like how do we already consult with local governments on things like this, and what might we be able to learn through those other efforts? And we do have the consultant team is actually working on looking at things like that, and I think that we'll have some additional information coming in. But I think that that's one part of this, that it will be really helpful and critical to get more local perspectives on exactly what that would look like across the state. So I just want to flag that that's one area that I think we'll see additional detail being filled in. So, okay, I'll go ahead and move on to ag impacts then, if there are not any other questions or comments. So the ag impacts group, again, I just kind of want to highlight here, there is some significant overlap between ag impacts and the municipal impacts and local government work group. And I think that really starts with the issue or question of what are the unintended impacts potentially of a demand management program, and what are the best ways to address them? Also, I think that the issue of equity is really, really implicated in both of these work groups. So if we are looking at the question of proportionality across the state, if we are seeing one sector where we're seeing a lot of participation, maybe some adverse impacts, what's the appropriate way to address those? And I think that some of the strategies that we can talk about in that last bit on the economic impacts in local government would inform this as well. So with that kind of introductory bit in mind, moving into the ag impacts work group, their goals that they identified were equitable and proportional program across the state. I think that goes back to what was really articulated in the 2018 support and policy statement. Next, minimize and mitigate off-farm impacts. And then any program should be a structured and guided market so that we're avoiding, to the extent we can, the adverse impacts that we don't want to see. And then finally, the program operation should align with growing season schedules. And we're going to see that mentioned, I think, in the trade-off section of the process considerations as well. So the elements of feasibility, kind of looking at how to carry out those goals and what elements really speak to whether we are able to or not able to achieve those goals. First, ag sector mitigation to address secondary impacts. Again, this goes back to what are the off-farm impacts that we might be seeing? What are proportionality issues that might come up, and what are the appropriate mechanisms to address those? And then agricultural participant field requirements to minimize impacts to neighbors. So maybe this is cover cropping, weed control, things like that. recognizing that'll be potentially an increased cost to the participant that might have some impacts on funding, or what the bottom line is, what are the guidelines or requirements in place for that. And then finally, kind of similar to the municipal sector assistance, what level of agricultural participant assistance are we able to offer? So what you'll see here is really, do we have opportunities to maybe work cooperatively with Extension to get help to kind of identify on-farm impacts, for example, for participants and how to address them. So this is a big one, and I apologize. It's a lot of text here on a slide, but it's a good time to remind you all that this complete framework is in your packet. So I'm sorry, but it is what it is. So first, the ag sector mitigation. I think just to maybe frame this issue, there was a lot of discussion, there has been a lot of discussion about what's really the appropriate way to do this. So I think it comes down to, can we identify specific verifiable impacts that are relating, that come about from demand management participation? Is it, a benefit to try to identify those and then mitigate them specifically? Or on the other hand, does it make sense to have a fund established, some kind of community economic development fund, and part of the program costs are just allocated to that? So we're not trying to directly track the benefits, or the impacts, but we're rather just deciding we're going to set up a fund with X amount in it that maybe we will give to some kind of local government or some kind of organization to help address those impacts. So to go back to the framework on A, we're not really doing a lot to track secondary economic impact, or secondary impacts rather, and not really mitigating them. And B, there's some kind of fund established, and we can talk about, as we go forward and get into more levels of additional detail, we can talk about what that fund would actually look like, how much would be appropriate, that type of thing. I think that's the kind of information we can kind of add in as we go along. But and then C, we're really, I guess, trying to track those impacts more closely. So we're trying to identify specifically what those impacts are, but also likely still developing some kind of fund to assist with those impacts. And maybe we see that fund being distributed among a few different entities, whether it's at the county level, the water management entity servicing the property, just kind of assistance to help deal with any of the impacts that we would see. And of course, that would require more money, not only for that fund, but also potential more money just for the coordination element of it. And we'll see that come through in the funding part. So the other thing, one issue here, I think, to think about is how do we determine who the appropriate, recipient for these funds would be? How do we determine the appropriate local entity? And if we are looking at more specific mitigation payment, who gets it? And how do we kind of make that decision? And I think those are the types of questions that, again, will really benefit from getting some input on this and getting more specificity. And then agricultural participant field requirements. So the A version here, there aren't any requirements. So we're not looking at cover crops. We're not really caring about weed and pest control in option A. People may do it, but we're not really involved in it. Option B contemplates working with Extension or local agencies to establish some guidelines for cover crops and how to do that. And we have maybe some technical assistance with limited monitoring of compliance there. And C, what's really different here is there's just more state staffing, there's more state funds and efforts being put into that monitoring of compliance with whatever kind of guidelines. One thing I'll note here, again, is that could add, it would potentially add a cost for the participant. So if we do require this, are we going to see people, needing to get paid more to participate? How is that going to affect the bottom line of what this program might cost? It also, could add to the complexity of monitoring and verification elements as well, of course. And And this is where, you know, just going back to the I think cooperation that would need to be in place, or coordination with the Department of Agriculture or others, because we might not fully understand, you know, the best cover cropping techniques. So we might really need some help in kind of establishing those appropriate guidelines and making sure that everyone understands what they are. And then finally, agricultural participant assistance. This is really kind of maybe zooming out a little bit to kind of figure all this stuff out and to figure out how to navigate this process. To what extent are we offering assistance or coordinating with other entities to offer assistance to potential participants? So that might be in terms of developing the application. It might be, you know, avoiding on-farm impacts. Any range of things that could arise that someone might need help with in kind of navigating this process. So again, with A, we're not offering that type of support, and B, we're maybe working with others who have a little bit more kind of understanding of how to go about this, whether it's extension or conservation districts or others who can really kind of provide on-the-ground assistance in this area. And then C, you know, this is kind of similar to the others. We're actually creating additional staff capacity to really try to help more directly with this. So one thing that was noted here is some participants might be, you know, there might be people they're more comfortable working with in this, you know, rather than state staff. It might be that it makes sense to work and collaborate with others to actually be the boots on the ground in terms of providing that type of assistance. And the other thing is that I'll note is that this also, I think, kind of parallels the education outreach elements. Maybe it's that, you know, we have more comprehensive information available on our website to kind of assist with this. And some or all of these options. So I think that is, that was a lot of information, and that's what I have for ag impacts. And it looks like Director Hawkins has a comment and question, so maybe I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Amy. That was a lot of information. My comment is that I'm pretty deeply uncomfortable with the idea that there's no mitigation for secondary impacts, even as an option. And I think we're going to get, I'm just not sure that that's a productive way to start this discussion, and would really encourage us to rethink that one. It's a big issue. My question is, there's a couple of things in the guiding principles about, you know, the equitable, proportional, and voluntariness, and also the structured and guided market. Are we going to see, you know, different options laid out elsewhere? They're not here, so I was wondering about that.
Yeah, that's a good question, and I think, you know, in many cases, I think that the actual, I don't know exactly how to put this, but what we tried to do was look at implementation options that would achieve, or in some cases maybe not achieve, the ultimate goals that the work groups identified. So I'm thinking in terms of like the proportional element. I think that the ultimate goal of, for example, consultation with local governments would be to achieve that, to feel as though people across the state feel like the program is fair, specifically because of the measures we're taking in coordination with local governments, whether it's to set up a mitigation fund, whether it is, you know, that we have local entities kind of reviewing applications that come in to ensure that we're not kind of getting up to that point where we might have a little bit too much participation in this area and see some issues. So maybe that's the kind of detail that we can flesh out a little bit more, just to draw a clearer line between the goal and how this implementation option might further that goal or not. And I also did want to, you know, I completely understand what you're saying about the discomfort in the A category. And I think we put this together knowing that there would be discomfort with some of these options. And we were trying to really show the full range of, on the bottom end, this is, what we will be doing or really not doing. And so I think, that being said, I think we can certainly think about how to maybe adjust that. So we're making clear that we're going to do something, and we can talk about, what specifically that would be. Maybe it is aligning with existing programs, or coordinating through existing efforts, or, working with our partners that we already have to address those. So I think we can certainly think about that. I'm trying to think if I answered. I know you had a couple questions, so remind me if I didn't address any of them.
I think you did. Thanks.
Director Brown?
Yes, thank you. I agree with Celine's comment that it's a bit of a non-starter, but it begs the question where I think Director Felt brought up earlier, are we comparing this to what? And it's really near impossible to make a comparison of demand management to the baseline of curtailment that we don't know. And so if you're treating A in the, for instance, the ag table as, well, we're not going to give you anything else because you should be glad that there is a compensated option against curtailment, then that is an alternative to demand management, right? But I don't think that's how we've structured this conversation. And I think we need to be clear about that. And I know that this is a more general question. You still have another table to go through. So I will place hold that I think we need to have a conversation, and I understand that it very much rests with the Division of Water Resources. But, all of this is compared to just some unknown that we're dealing with. And I think that is really something we've all known. But when you're looking at, what can be maybe relative to NEPA alternatives, if you live in that world, you're still not comparing it to your baseline. You still don't know what this baseline is. And so I think we need to discuss what that comparison is and how we communicate that with our stakeholders across the state. If they should be lucky to be compensated, great. That's something that, I think we have all, at least I won't speak for the rest of the board, but it's certainly something that we have brought up again and again and again in the Yampa Basin. So there's my one comment on that, and we can maybe talk a little bit more. I'd love to hear what some of the other board members have to say about that as we get into the more general discussion. But as a more pointed portion of this conversation, as I was thinking of the multiple times that the local entities have been brought up in here, and I love, the consulting with the Department of Agriculture and CPW and Extension, and then we get into this sort of localized entity. And I think, it's a unique way to look at how we make sure that individual basins are represented, but there's also a ton of inequity there. Our local agencies across the state have different expertise, they have different staffing, they have different funding, they have different capacities across the board. And so even if we were to go, again, I'll just use my basin, there is not one entity in the Yampa or in the White that is legally representative, boundary-wise, of either of those basins in a whole. In a whole, not in a hole. That would not be they're not in a hole. So while I like it, I think that it is an added layer of complexity that we will have to flesh out, when we get into asking for feedback on that. So I just wanted to point out that, it's again, a great example of there's not going to be any one size fits all in this. And I'll stop there for now. I'm sure other people have comments.
Thanks, Director Brown. I'm seeing Director Felt, and then Director Schwartz, and then Director Trick.
Thanks, Amy. This may be another one of these like really obvious issues that is foundational to everything you've done already, but I'm just kind of wondering about it. And the ag thing brings it into focus for me, which is that obviously the water rights that stand to lose in a curtailment situation are going to be on the more junior side of history, at least if we just administer it according to prior appropriation, however that plays out among the basins. But it doesn't really matter. Like, just generally, I think that's the whole premise. And yet it seems to me, and so please tell me if I'm wrong here, but it seems to me that the most beneficial or valuable water rights to demand management, to making that really work, are apt to be more senior. And obviously this is temporary, well, never mind the temporary, but it's compensated and voluntary. So, some people are making decisions based on what makes sense to their individual circumstances and everything. But as far as implementation goes, in achieving the desired results, I would think that frequently a more senior water right would have more to offer, right, over a longer period of time, be more dependable, particularly in times of lower supply availability, which is what we're contemplating. That's the whole sort of underlying premise here. And so it's just an interesting dynamic where you go from, on the one hand, injuring junior water rights to the solution being benefiting or creating more value for senior water rights.
Is it a good time to jump in there?
Go ahead.
Okay. There's a lot there, but I guess maybe one thing just to be very clear about, I think at the outset, is that I think a demand management program would be open to it wouldn't. So I guess there are two things that would be true. One is it would need to create more wet water, right? It would need to create conserved consumptive use that we can get down to Powell. Also true, I think that participation would be open. It would not be the seniority of the water rights is not really necessarily a factor in who can participate. It would be open to, I think, everyone, as long as they kind of fit the terms of whatever program that we would come up with. So I don't, subject to the first part that we would need to create wet water, I don't know that it would be necessarily only senior rates that would actually end up participating in a program like that. I would like to think that we would have a broad range of participation, and that we would do what we can to kind of ensure that we have a broad range of participation, perhaps. I don't know if I'm answering that.
Well, maybe that just take my thought a little further, that I agree, it should be open to anyone, but I think when it comes to achieving the biggest impact on deficit, so to speak, that maybe senior water rights may have more to offer because they're in priority more or all the time, and they just they're more dependable for this program, particularly in times of shortage. But it also strikes me that those same water rights present more, or the suspension of those water rights or diminishment of their diversions or things like that create more potential impacts that would need to be addressed for other water rights. The return flow elements and things like that. It makes it even more complex the further sort of up the food chain you go.
One thing I'm also reminded of is that going back to the hypotheticals, I think that this kind of raises a good, it's the type of question that it may be more appropriately addressed in terms of imagining a particular type of participant and how that would fit within kind of the programmatic elements we're talking about. And I think that the hypotheticals that were developed in the Ag Impacts Work Group, the Monitoring and Verification Work Group, and maybe some others, and maybe finding some time to work through those might be helpful to the issues that you're raising. And like I said earlier, we've been kind of trying to figure out exactly how those fit into all of this or where. But I think that we can certainly have more discussion on that going forward. And I seem to no longer be able to access my chat, but I vaguely remember, I think Director Schwartz and then Director Trick maybe were up next. Correct me if I'm wrong, but feel free to jump in.
Thank you. Appreciate your comments, Director Felt. I do have, again, just sort of a 30,000 foot level. I know that some of the earlier studies in the Gunnison Basin trying to frame impacts, I personally think that we're not looking potentially at the whole picture, that we could see if water were stayed in these streams, that there could be other benefits to basins and to regions. So one, how do we measure these impacts? And how do we factor in maybe positive impacts to local economies? Secondly, where can we provide opportunities for participants to look at maybe some other on-farm activities, agritourism, looking at maybe efficiencies or other investments that could bring viability to areas and basins, that as opposed to just thinking that it's going to be all negative impacts as we're not just drying up everything. So I think that when we minimize, I think that's a very important conversation. What are the opportunities on both sides of the equation to minimize? And then I do have questions around the structure and guided market. And I know we've talked about what that could look like and the issues around compensation, and again, having this equitable distribution of opportunities/impacts. So I guess I do like, I'd like to make sure that we are able to measure impacts accurately and also measure opportunities. But secondly, I'd like to have a little better understanding on the structure and guided market, how we're going to arrive at that structured guided market and ensure the equity and opportunity for those that would like to participate. So that's a question.
Thanks, Director Schwartz. I think that's a really good question. And I think that this is maybe an instance where it would have been helpful and maybe will be helpful to draw a clearer line and flesh things out a little bit more. I think one way that we were thinking about it is in terms of the guided market piece and the proportionality and a lot of that, the goal would be, I think, to really leverage the coordination element of this, whether it is with local governments or others, to begin to identify specifically what the local issues are. Because I guess in my mind, it's really hard to track issues of proportionality. It's really hard to track issues of, is this market is this market working for this particular region without having that local input? I don't feel like sitting here, today in Denver, like I or others necessarily can say, this is what it's going to look like there. And these are the tools that are there to help deal with that. And so in my mind, especially as you're looking at like for example, the C implementation option in economic or the coordination with local governments, I think what we would see could be a really like robust process of coordinating with whatever agencies and that's the question, who's appropriate where? How do we actually do that, in a way that makes sense, which might not be the same across the state, and ultimately kind of developing this more evolving program where it's changing as we go based on the input we're receiving, to address those issues as they come up, to make sure that we're not getting into an area where we don't have a proportional program, or where one part of the state is saying this isn't working for us and we don't feel like this is fair. Devil's in the details, right? Like what does that actually look like? What processes would help with that? And I think that those are the kind of specific questions that hopefully we can get more input on going forward. And I also take Director Brown's comment that there's really a lot of diversity in terms of how much capacity local governments have. So are there areas where we really do need more state staff support to, in whatever way that looks like, or funds to make sure that we are identifying and addressing those issues at a local level. So that's, I think what we can do though for now is to really kind of try to draw that line a little bit more in the framework, and to make clear that the whole point of this type of consultation and coordination would be specifically to proactively address those types of issues, like what type of guided market makes sense, and how are we ensuring proportionality across the state. Hopefully that's somewhat helpful. And I also did just want to comment on your, I think, comment about how are we tracking benefits of this? And I think that's a really good question. And one thing I'll note is that we do still have this ongoing literature review that our consultant team is helping us with. And I think that, hopefully we can maybe get some more information about, okay, when there are programs like this, do we see local benefits? Are we seeing people spending more money in their local communities? And how is that actually benefiting these communities? So I think that there is room to kind of do a little bit more digging on that question. And I think Director Trick was next, and then looks like Director Dutton after that.
Thanks, Amy. Just a quick comment and then a question. So the first comment is I agree with the statements and the comments made by Director Brown and Director Hawkins as far as ag impacts table here. And then my question is actually related to the format of this worksheet and all these tables that we have in front of us as far as implementation options A, B, and C. I guess my assumption right now is that by putting stuff into columns A, B, or C, that is not assigning a value to that option or ranking that option necessarily, but I guess thinking about what these tables look like, maybe you can address that. I mean, are we putting things into column A because that column is supposedly ranking that option, or why is it set up that way?
It's a great question, Director Trick, and I think it's a really, really important thing to highlight, that it is not at all intended to be a ranking or like a, worst situation best. It's really intended to be, it's roughly based on level of complexity. So I think in A, what you'll see is while maintaining compliance with the demand management storage agreement, all applicable law, everything, what is the kind of least that we can do to implement a demand management program? And that, again, there are trade-offs there, right? Maybe that's cheap, but maybe it's really, really not palatable. Maybe it's really not advisable to create a program where we're not tracking any potential negative impacts, right? So I do just want to be very, very clear about that this is not intended to be any kind of ranking, but it is intended to be varying levels of complexity and showing the trade-offs associated with choosing those different options in different situations.
Okay, thank you. I think that's a very important point to clarify going forward, and also when the public's looking at this, to make sure that is clear.
Could not agree more. And I think Director Dutton was next.
Thanks, Amy. I'm a little behind here on typing comment in the chat, but I just wanted to give my thoughts kind of to Director Felt's comments or kind of his questions about are we in effect changing or inflating or influencing the price of water maybe unproportionally between junior and senior water rights. And I would say that I don't think so in the context that we were talking about it. And it's because I guess the sideboards are kind of the parameters in which I'm thinking about this are similar to the on the ground situation that we're living down here in the San Luis Valley with the groundwater management subdistricts. And one of the mechanisms that the subdistricts are using is forbearance, where, and to maybe back up a second, the subdistricts are required to replace injurious stream depletions on a daily basis. And so whatever the models show the wells are impacting the streams by, the subdistricts have to put water into the rivers to make up that impact. There's a tool called forbearance where the ditch companies can choose to either take the wet water from the impact, or they can choose to take money in place of the wet water. And it's a totally different tool, and there's a lot of differences here. But I do think that the similarity between forbearance and what we're talking about as far as a potential demand management program are the similarities are that it's the voluntary, compensated, market-driven program where if it's a two-way street. And so the subdistricts is that central entity, which again, I think there's kind of a nice parallel because we're talking about the need for there to be, a central entity running it. They work with the ditch companies and kind of establish this market value. And so what it's saying is that you're not necessarily making individual water rights more valuable. A senior water right still gets paid the same amount of forbearance as a junior water right, a same amount per acre foot. But you are saying that, of course, a senior ditch would end up getting more money because they would be in priority more often. But I don't think that is changing the market, because the effect today is that the senior water rights are worth more because the water is in priority longer. And so I think this is just an additional factor that would play into the value of water rights in the Colorado Basin as a whole, but not necessarily make certain worth more than others. But I guess others might weigh in with different thoughts, but that's just kind of my thought based on the experience down here.
Thanks, Director Dutton. That is, I think, really helpful insight. And I know we're running a little bit behind, and I don't see any questions or comments at this time. So I might go ahead and hand it over to Greg Johnson. He's going to cover process considerations and then funding. And as I said earlier, we're kind of viewing funding as like bottom line, tally that all up, and what does that cost us, and what are the options for funding that scale of a program? One thing I want to make just abundantly clear here is that, as we've all highlighted, I think, through this discussion, there is a lot of this is a high level. There's a lot of detail that we might want to talk about, that we might develop more throughout the process of developing this framework that could really impact the funding element. So the numbers that we're going over today, or the concepts, are really very, very high level. They shouldn't be taken as kind of the bottom line of what a demand management program may cost. And we expect that these will really evolve quite a bit as we're refining this and developing it further. So I think Greg will probably cover these two items relatively quickly, so we have enough time for more discussion and also discussion of next steps in the engagement element of this that Sarah will cover. So I just wanted to highlight that and let you all know there will be more to come on all of this, but in particular, I think the funding discussion. So with that, I think, Greg, if you're ready to go ahead and take it away on process.
Great, thanks, Amy. Definitely look forward to further discussion around all of this. And as Amy mentioned, the process considerations really are kind of a placeholder at this point. So we wanted to look at the mechanics of how you would actually structure a program. Through the discussions with the tech team, through the work groups, a lot of this kind of came to the fore, that we really do need to kind of put this out as its own separate item to really look at kind of what some of these considerations might be. As such, obviously it did not have its work group. We don't have goals. We don't have elements of feasibility called out, but we do, have this as part of the matrix, again, at this point to really serve as a placeholder. So first of all, we looked at soliciting projects, so really contemplating the extent to which the state is actively seeking participation in a DM program. So true to form, as with all of these options, and again, thanks to Director Trick for kind of calling out that we really did not intend for there to be a value judgment between these different columns, so A, B, C, but column A would be no solicitation. Column B, option B, would be funding would be offered to assist potentially with project development. And then option C, we would have additional staff support in addition to funding to really help with the solicitation of projects. For the application requirements, the amount of detail and information required when someone really applies to participate in the DM program. So how would we actually set up this structure for the applications? Option A is a very low level of complexity for the application, so perhaps similar to some of our programs that we currently have. So not a whole lot of other stringent requirements. Option B, really looking to include information about certain elements, for example, mitigation and monitoring elements, as were discussed in a lot of detail by Michelle earlier. And then option C, looking at a more complete, complex application that also includes a certification process. So having a lot of those mitigation monitoring elements as well as, a really more formal certification projects that applicants would potentially have to meet for minimum requirements. And then finally, speaking to kind of how these projects would be selected, we have option A, which would be more of an open enrollment process, so no certification, really going on a review on a project by project basis as they come in, kind of a rolling basis. Option B, looking at an annual RFP process, so having a much more formal structure to that. And then option C, kind of building on a formal structure, but having a certification process through which the participants can be certified to participate in multiple years. And of course, assuming all the other criteria are met. So again, that's really kind of just the placeholder for how we're looking at that, initially to really look at the mechanics of the program. Amy, I don't know if we wanted to take questions at this point before diving into funding. If we just want to get through to the broader discussion that you all have.
Yeah, I wonder if we should just kind of push through and then, of course, we can discuss in greater detail in the discussion section, but.
Sounds good. Thanks, Amy. And of course, feel free to speak up or use the chat if board members have questions. So getting into the funding, as Amy noted, a lot of this piece is really responsive to everything else that's been discussed today. So all the times that Amy and Michelle and Sarah had kind of noted, that XYZ may be more expensive, might be more complicated. The task here is to really start to flesh that out. Again, as Amy noted, this is really just kind of a rough baseline at this point to really establish what things may look like moving forward. So there's a lot of factors at play here. Again, it's pretty high level overview, and so we really do seek to add a lot more specificity to this as this evolves and moves forward in the months ahead. So I did want to note that the goals and considerations piece of this. We really were looking at this from the work group perspective as more of an acknowledgement of a lot of these different issues, and really less as goals. So it really doesn't fit, quite as well in that framework of a traditional goal. The costs would be influenced by many factors. So this would include things like program design, scale, participation. For example, we may not be able to control or design for the market forces and the costs that participants are willing to take to participate. And then a portfolio of funding sources would definitely need to be considered. So these are the things that the work group spent, many, many hours discussing. As for, I think, next slide there. Thanks, Amy. As for the elements of feasibility, there are really two big ones. So number one, how much would this cost? Really looking at the range of costs to compensate participants and how much to really run the program. And then where do we find that money? So where are the funding sources? This is based on the needs of the program, how we actually cobble this all together. A few things I wanted to note, again, going back to the work group and how things evolved. The work group really developed these concepts of, potential elements that may impact the cost of a program and available funding sources. So they really tried to create a straw man, and in some ways, they were really leading this conversation about what a straw man could look like. Based on these inputs and these concepts, many of them were kind of baked into the framework. So again, as I've said, a lot of this is really kind of in that structure already. And then finally, kind of based on all this information, again, at a very high level, the consultant team worked to really develop these baseline kind of cost ranges. So getting into the actual framework. So again, the last piece here of the funding and the compensation rate range. We really wanted to keep the compensation for the program steady across the different range of options. So this is $100 to $500. $100 per acre may appear low, but wanted to note that in the SCPP, so in the System Conservation Pilot Program, there were multiple sources involved in many aspects. And so although the state cost was low, participants were paid from some of these other sources. So contemplating that some participants may require some of this other money that would come in, again, from a more complex structure of sources. Also wanted to note that some of the program design elements contemplate cover crops. So this has been factored into the analysis where some of these costs may be higher, but then a lot of that will go right back out for things like cover cropping, and then also the monitoring piece of that may be a lot more complicated, as we've discussed. And then finally, the program cost. So how much does it cost to actually run the program? And this is the complicated mix of things that we've already discussed. So how do you go about all the different monitoring and verification options, administration and accounting, a lot of those other things that we've gone through in much more detail today. And of course, things get more complicated as you move across the matrix. Again, as we've discussed for the different options A, B, and C. So for the compensation range, option A, we really looked at 10% of the cost of the program, of really running the program, went directly into the compensation piece of this, resulting in a potential cost of $3 to $16 million. Option B puts 30% of the program costs due to additional outreach, mitigation, things like that, taking the total cost up to between 5 and 20 million. Option C, again, because this is kind of the much more involved, much more complex problem, would have much higher program costs. So looking at maybe 65% of the costs going directly into actually running the program. So bringing those up to between 12 and about 30 million for the total costs. And then stepping down to the funding options, just again, kind of scraping the surface on where we might get some of this money based on a lot of the discussion that work group had with these various sources that could come to bear. But looking at potential budget reallocation for option A, looking at some sort of increased fees, however that could be structured moving forward. And then option C, all of the above, having a pot of money with multiple parties, multiple sources really contributing to it. So that's really the table in its entirety. My apologies for going through so quickly. I really do want to get to much more of the broader discussion around this. But of course, we are happy to take any questions on any of these details.
And it does look like Director Trick put a question in the chat.
Thank you, Amy, and thanks, Greg, for presenting on that. I just wanted to clarify, or I had a clarifying question about the program costs and what's baked into that. So the cost of running the program is infrastructure for monitoring and verification, such as flumes, recording devices, bypass structures. Is that baked into this program cost estimate?
Good question, Director Trick. I think as much as possible, again, at a very, very high level. So a lot of, the complexity that we've discussed today, we tried to put some pretty rough numbers on this, but this is something we can flesh out quite a bit more. And then, of course, it gets even more complicated. I'll hand it over to Amy in a minute here, and Sarah to kind of wrap this up. But, how we would put a program together between all of the different options of A, B, and C through everything that we've discussed today, whether it's monitoring and verification, environmental considerations, however that is kind of cobbled together, makes it that much more complicated to kind of add up those columns. So initially, we really wanted to just get a very rough baseline for kind of those three basic categories. But actually looking at some of those pieces, field level verification, things like that, it gets, a lot more complicated pretty quickly.
Thanks.
Sure.
I have a comment on this too. Sorry to not use the chat. So I just want to make sure that I understand something. If it is a higher cost in the C column, sorry, there's no row number. So let's see, range of annual costs, row C, column C. We do go with the 30 million, say, that doesn't mean that we are also selecting that we are using one of row funding sources, that same column C, right? That could be any, it could still be the higher budget, but paid by state through budget reallocation. That's correct?
Correct, Director Brown. That's my understanding. So
okay.
We're trying to factor in that flexibility at this point.
And I know that funding is a big deal, obviously. I think there needs to be a very robust conversation around the acceptance of donations and grants. This is a lot different than SCPP. I know that they get compared often when we, have conversations about the possibility of a demand management program. But I think, Greg, I know that you especially understand how different they are. So I'm trying to provide feedback here that's beyond more robust discussion needed, but I don't have any more right now. So that grants and donation sort of hangs out there without much explanation. So we, and I think it connects to that 100 to 500 acre foot range too. And I don't understand how some people could receive $100 from the state, but then like other money from somewhere else. That this is just opening up a total wormhole for me. This is very confusing, that range. So maybe there's an explanation, or maybe you're just acknowledging that a range could exist.
Correct. More the latter, Director Brown. We really wanted to keep that range open across these different options at this point, kind of understanding the universe of programs that have occurred before, where things could go, but to really not to make any sort of call on that at this point. looking at things like SCPP, hovering around $200 an acre foot, but then also thinking about things like, the cover crop issue and how that could, again, take, $100 right back out, and how that, may be structured moving forward. So a lot, by definition, this is very open-ended at this point. And I think, as you noted, there are potentially wormholes to go down, but this is part of the what we wanted to open up for discussion. And then again, leave this open to refinement moving forward. This is one of the least refined items. This is why we put it at the end by definition, because it does rely on a lot of these other considerations.
Sure. So my last comment, I know other people are in line here. I think that the 100 acre foot to 500 acre foot range needs to be asterisked, because we have not, as a board or as a state and any other department that I'm aware of, capped the potential compensation for these, for fallowing per acre or per acre foot or whatever that looks like. So I just wonder if putting it in there is just premature, since we haven't had that conversation.
Yeah, Director Brown, I think that's fair. And I also, just kind of echoing what Greg said, do want to point out, we've had plenty of thoughts, ideas, and discussions with our, consultant team, for example, about a lot of things about potential funding sources, but we wanted to kind of respect and respond to the fact that so many elements of this framework are going to benefit, I think, from getting additional detail based on input that we receive. And so we didn't want to, even though we have ideas about how it could all look, we didn't want to get ahead of those portions of the framework, which kind of puts us in a place where it's like, here's a very big range of what this could be. And I also do take your point as far as funding sources go. And just like Greg said, this is not reflective of, it's not like you choose A and then therefore it's a budget reallocation. But I think that we can certainly work to kind of flesh out exactly what that would look like. What a program design might look like if we are bringing in contributions from a variety of sources and kind of having a pool. So we can certainly refine that.
Thank you. Sorry, I don't want to take up the conversation, but thinking about it from a lower basin perspective, if you were to see this and think, oh, they can get water for 100 to 500 acre feet, sweet. Let's give them a bigger pool. I just feel like it doesn't reflect the actual value of water. And I know that that's a huge conversation, and it's not one we're going to have today, but I think we should refigure this funding table in a way that is more reflective of the ambiguity of the conversation and of the audience that may read it potentially as well. That's all.
And I do think one option would be just to remove entirely, like you suggested, the compensation rate range, knowing that we all kind of have an idea under various circumstances of what could impact that, and instead just focus on the total costs, specifically looking at program implementation costs and how that's going to impact things, knowing, again, we might be looking at a range for compensation per acre foot of water that we really don't know enough to define right now or don't want to define right now. So I think that's something we could do.
Great. It looks like we have a question from Director Dutton. Or maybe Jackie hit on that question, I think. So we may be near the end here. Any other questions from board members?
Are we still going to go into like an open discussion format, or have we lost that time?
Director Brown, we absolutely are. Okay, so cool. Just a couple more slides. So just bear with us to kind of put this together, and I'll hand it back over to Amy and Sarah.
I think we're actually pretty much ready to kind of go into some discussion. I am just going to, one idea that we could, just thinking about next steps and going forward and how to kind of bring this all together. I've been taking a lot of notes and I think have some pretty specific ideas about some adjustments we could make at this point. So we do have some time on the March board meeting. I think we have half an hour for demand management discussion that we're kind of planning on being overflow as needed from this. We didn't have anything specific. So one thing we could do is maybe make some adjustments. Greg, kick me if this is a terrible idea because I haven't talked to you about this yet. Make some adjustments here and kind of use that time to just show you based on this input how we're going to change some things before we initiate the kind of engagement process across the state. Greg, does that sound okay to you? Okay.
Sounds great.
Okay.
100%.
Okay. But we did also just want to briefly, Sarah, I think will walk us through that engagement piece and what kind of what the plan is. And Sarah, maybe if you could cover that, I'm sorry, but relatively quickly. And then we can kind of come back to kind of closing discussion and next steps.
That works for me, Amy. Okay. So can you hear me okay? All right, okay. So this is a little bit, again, different from the education outreach work group goals that we discussed a little bit earlier. And we also want to ensure that we're sufficiently communicating what the state is doing right now and throughout its feasibility investigation process. And that we're creating opportunities for people to provide input during that process. So this will include regular press releases, as we have started to do since the beginning of the process, and continuing to do timely public notices about upcoming meetings and workshop opportunities as they come up. And this also includes working with water partners across the state to maintain updated and consistent messaging in order to avoid public confusion and make sure that everyone is aware that we're all on the same page, our water partners and the state. So shown here on the slide, we created a engagement triangle for the engagement process for the feasibility investigation. So first on the bottom, we have public input, public meetings, and broader input will be focused on first. And then we bring those concerns to our water community for discussion. And then finally up to the board for decision making. So I think this is a helpful kind of little visual tool that we can use in our resources moving forward as we continue informing the public about the process and trying to be transparent as possible. And then finally, we do plan on, similar to what I just explained with the press releases, we do plan on releasing another press release following, I was going to say this workshop, but once we feel comfortable with the framework as is, and it's in a good place for a draft to move on from that, and we'll include this engagement triangle and then also our, our Engage CWCB page as well. So going back to two resources I want to share, we created a board toolkit, which I believe I emailed everybody earlier before the workshop with a link to that. So that is to provide quick access to our most up-to-date information, documents, our work plan, our frequently asked questions document that we put together recently, press statements, and all kinds of things like that. So in this Google folder, we can update it as we go, and you can use it as a reference guide as you go out to meetings and talk with folks about the process. So hopefully you find that helpful. And then the second thing I wanted to bring up was we have updated, or we are continuing to update our engagecwcb.org/DM page, which we will be adding a public survey to kind of bring in that first piece of the engagement triangle, the public input piece. So we are going to work on that, and we'll let you know when that is up ready to go. But in the meantime, we have a soft launch poll question that we've added to that page, asking the public what resources would be more helpful to help them understand the concept of demand management and ultimately the framework of demand management a little bit better. So those include case studies, a video, frequently asked questions, which we have already, we can continue to update, email updates, and a town hall style meeting. And then some more information about what resources we have not listed that would be helpful. And we also have a field for zip code and email. So we can start putting together some more data on the demographics of the folks that we are getting public input from, which is great. Anything else? Yeah, and then any feedback that you have on our current investigation process, communications tactics that we are using, please reach out to me. I'd love to hear them. That's it, I think, Amy.
Thanks so much, Sarah. So I know there's a lot of information presented today with the understanding that I think the next step will be to have another discussion about this at the board meeting coming up, and we'll come prepared to talk through some adjustments we will have made to the framework based on this discussion, and then maybe start this public input process shortly after that. So with all that in mind for next steps, I did just want to open it up to kind of general discussion about all of this.
Well, I was going to let somebody else talk, but I have some general discussion. I was just thinking of maybe one, like you say, this is a lot of information. It's a lot to digest, and obviously there's a lot not embedded in the tables. And to synthesize, what we've learned from the work groups and just in our own experiences with the table is time consuming. So I guess, one offering I would make is that maybe in lieu of having a workshop that we try to cover everything, we could maybe divide and conquer and do some shorter, maybe 1 to 2 hour workshops on specific elements of the framework. And that way, if there's board members and members of the public that want to engage specifically on some items, that's their bailiwick. Great. If they want to engage on everything, then, we can make time for that. But, I think it's a little bit overwhelming to go through that and then have, 12 minutes in which to have any meaningful type of discussion. So I guess I would just offer that as a way that the board can provide meaningful feedback that can really get down into some of these elements in a way that provides you with direction and also keeps us, 100% engaged and on board as we indicated that we wanted to be throughout this step 2 process. So that would be my feedback for now.
I think that, that's a good comment and good idea, and we can definitely talk about how to do something like that. And then Director Brody and then Director Anderson, I think, are lined up in the chat.
Thanks, Amy. First of all, I want to commend staff on all the thought that went into this framework. I think it is a good way to think through options and think through trade-offs and get some feedback. I'm sure that there are going to be people who like certain elements of this, I think you're going to get some strong reactions to others, and that's okay. It provides us further direction, and will help us figure out, where to go next. But I think, it is a good step forward. So thank you for that work. To me, I think that the area that perhaps needs most attention is this whole concept of secondary impacts, and to what extent is it the board's role, CWCB's role, to try to address those through this program, and what are the different strategies, again, at a 50,000 foot level, of how you might do that. One option, which I think, we've talked about, may get some pretty negative reaction, is to simply ignore those secondary impacts. If you think about this in economic terms, you could have a very economically efficient market that focuses just on the immediate water user who may contribute water to the system. You could have a super efficient market for those water users that has significant ramifications on the rest of their community, of the state as a whole. Another option would be to try to mitigate all of those secondary impacts. The trade-off there is that this program might get so burdened by those secondary impacts that it may not be workable. It may not be feasible. It might not be something the state can afford to do. Another sort of concept that we've talked about is more of a peanut butter approach, of which essentially recognizes that there are secondary impacts, and that our strategy is essentially to spread the burden, so that no one sector, no one community is bearing all of that cost and that burden of those secondary impacts, while the rest of the state benefits by avoiding a curtailment, which is obviously the goal. There may be other strategies, but I think, that to me is an area that probably deserves thought sooner rather than later, in terms of, again, just kind of what are those high level options for how we might deal with secondary impacts, to see if, there's one approach versus another that seems more palatable or more feasible for the state. So I'll just leave it at that. I mean, obviously we're not going to solve all of the issues today, but I think this is a good step forward, and looking forward to the conversation and to hearing from our state as to what they think. Thanks.
Thank you, Director Brody. I can't find the chat.
Yeah, maybe I can help. I think Director Anderson was next. And then Director Dutton had a comment regarding impacts.
My turn. Thank you. And Director Brody stole some of my thunder there. The flow sheets that accompanied this discussion were very well thought out, and I commend you and Greg, Amy, for the efforts there, and excellent job, in my opinion. So thank you. There's lots of issues here, and it's showing in those flow charts that there's a lot of work going ahead, and to gain public support for this effort. So I thank you.
And Director Dutton, I believe, was next.
Thank you, Director Brody. I just wanted to kind of pipe in, and I agree with your assessment that the secondary impacts is definitely an issue that we need to look into further. And I, kind of building off of what Director Felt said way back a couple hours ago, I think I'm really wrestling with how do we parse out what impacts are are caused by demand management or potentially caused by demand management, and therefore should be mitigated, versus what impacts could occur otherwise if a program wasn't in place. And so perhaps, this is the lesser of, two impacts. And then I think the third option is, in a reality where we're dealing with long-term mega droughts and climate change, there's going to be continued impacts on agriculture and water users across the West. And so I guess I know that, we're us figuring this out today obviously isn't going to happen, but I would kind of add that thought or plant that seed for staff as we're considering how would we mitigate secondary impacts. I think we kind of need to dial into the definition of secondary impacts and just what it is that we're talking about, what the scale and scope is, and have an honest conversation as a board of what we feel like we are potentially responsible for. I think the conversation about cover crops and making sure that if there was a water lease that occurred on a piece of ground, that we're not just contributing to aridification of that landscape. I think that is totally appropriate. But then, there's that larger chain where these impacts could just go forever. And so how do we really define them? And I think that's where I would just let staff know that it sounds, it's hard for me to wrap my arms around it. And so I would imagine it is for you too.
I think, so Robert Zaccato, we can get to you in just a minute. I think those are all the comments at the moment from the board, and I do want to be respectful. We did have a few individuals sign up to make public comment. So Amy, if it's okay with you, why don't we hear from those folks? And Robert, I'll put you on that list, and would love to hear from you. So just in order of sign up, we've got Ed Millard, Paul Boucher, James Eklund, and then Robert. Looks like Ed isn't present, so why don't we go to Paul?
Thank you, Director Brody. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yep.
Excellent, thanks. Thanks so much to all the directors today for comments and conversation, regarding this presentation. I thought it was very helpful, and thank you to staff for your ongoing work with the words demand management. I actually lose sleep for all of you almost every night at how you put together these presentations. So thank you for your continuing efforts. Given that we're running late, I could speak for a long time, and I'll try and make my comments brief. Where, I tend to struggle in the concept of completely separating, this talk of demand management and in general water conservation and where we are in a time and place within our state, the Southwest in general. And I think so many of the director's comments today, steered on that relative to the ag impacts conversation and where we're going. There's a lot of information out there. There's a lot of ideas, concepts, truth testing that needs to be done that I think that we can achieve. And I think that we can do it through continued collaboration. I also think that, prior to being under the gun based on involuntary curtailment, we're at a time and place where we have that possibility of collaboration and partnership. We have, a microscope on this particular topic and conversation. We have a number of NGOs and philanthropic people and organizations that are willing to work with us. And I think that breaking down, some of these questions of unknown, cover cropping was mentioned so many times today, water conservation, regenerative agriculture, and what we're generally speaking of. I think that, we're in a time and place as a culture where we kind of need to reinvent some of the practices that we participate in. And when we look at that based on the demand management topic, I want to clarify that I believe fully where it's at. I remain in a position of being no more for or against, that it's a feasibility analysis. but that if we have projects that we can work towards in research, demonstration, pilot capacity that work towards understanding the feasibility of demand management, but also are educating all of us, our culture about water conservation, these are not wasted efforts. And that's something, a message, to the board that I hope that you would take into consideration, is I think it's a time where we need to throw spaghetti at the wall. We live in, desperate times. Our supply demand gap in water continues to make me lose more sleep, along with staff and demand management presentations. And I think that there's a long way to go with this. The amount of research and global attention on regenerative ag, water conservation is part of that dialogue and part of what's going on. And I think that there are many that are willing to work on this topic in an aggressive capacity, in a way that keeps our municipalities and our water suppliers healthy and good, that keeps agriculture productive and profitable. And I, as well as many that I know, are ready to go to work in a capacity of not being any more for or against, or having it be a foregone conclusion. But I hope that we continue to address some of the science, research, and potential projects that can aid in making decisions for this program. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Paul. Appreciate you being part of the conversation. James, you're next. Is James Eklund on?
I am. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Sorry about that. So my comments, Paul put it very, very well and more eloquently than I could. I want to underscore the urgency that we face. It's really great. And frankly, it's a testament to the process we followed in Colorado's water plan to hear from all stakeholders and hear the concerns that are very valid and meaningful in putting together the thoughts on a program or determining the feasibility of a program. What I don't want lost is the hydrologic reality that we're playing with. Mother Nature cares not for the conversations we're having. I wish it did, or wish she did, but she doesn't. And we have to play with the hydrologic deck that we're, hand that we're dealt. The board's in a position to exercise the leadership that Dr. Stolp and that Speaker Rush George called for almost 3 months ago. And it involves, I think, in my perspective, making sure that you don't let perfect be the enemy of good, that you move forward with a project or a program that allows for the demand management account to be populated in a manner that happens in time to do something for the system, which is failing. And it's 60, let's see, it is 63 degrees at 13th and Washington here in Denver, Colorado today. And that means that our snowpack is not going to behave the way we all want it to behave when runoff comes. In fact, runoff may be starting sooner rather than we would hope it would. So in any event, I won't ramble on. I probably already have, but please know that you have support to be leaders and to exercise that leadership now, as opposed to weeks, months, years from now, when it may not do us any good. So thanks for the opportunity to comment.
Thanks for sharing your perspective. Robert, you have the floor.
Thank you, Director Brody. Thank you, board members. A great, interesting conversation today, and thanks to all the staff as well. And I can't believe it was July of 2019. I started working on one of the work groups, and I think all the way along the way, my perspective of what the possibilities for demand management has changed. So I would agree with Paul that I think there's a lot of options out there, and the way you're presenting is fantastic. I have a suggestion though. Maybe it can be, instead of the ABC, you can create a demand management Rubik's Cube so that you can shift them all around and develop it. It's a puzzle that we have to put together, I think, for the benefit of the state of Colorado, and I think we really can. So a couple quick comments maybe is, and thanks to Michelle, I was on the monitoring and verification work group, and what a great job of synthesizing all of our comments that we participated there. On the guiding principles, I suggest we add that transparency under that, because I think that we talked about that, how important it is for transparency of how you're monitoring, going to what Director Brown said about the community understanding how that's going to be monitored along the way. And then also maybe you've had this and I haven't followed it, but I had the opportunity to be a part of the kickoff when the Upper Basin states met in Utah. I'd be interested about what's going on in the shared efforts across the Upper Basin states in this area. So again, thanks very much, and I look forward to our continued work in this area.
Thank you. Is Peter Mayer on? Did he want to make a comment? I don't see him, so hopefully we'll have an opportunity to catch his comment next time. Amy, I believe that's it, and I'll turn the floor back over to you.
Thank you so much, Director Brody. I don't really have anything to add. I just want to say thank you all so much for taking the time today and giving us some really, really, I think, helpful feedback that we're going to go back with and incorporate, and we'll talk about this again next week. And I look forward to continuing this discussion. It's, a long road ahead of us, but it's, it's, I think, worth the complex discussion that it entails. So.
And thank you again to CWCB staff, and we'll continue the conversation next week. See you all.
Thank you. See you all.